Welcome back to another episode of Beyond Contact. I am Captain Ron, and today we're going to be speaking with aviation safety engineer and educator Dr. Todd Curtis. Dr. Curtis has spent most of his career in some aspect of aviation safety, particularly analyzing aviation safety data and understanding aviation risks. While he's been aware of the UFO and the UAP issue for decades, it was the famous case in 2006 at the Chicago O'Hare Airport, and in particular the lack of any real official response to that event, that made him realize that this phenomenon had both an aviation safety issue and a national security dimension that deserved more of a serious approach. How you doing, Todd? Good to see you.
Well, I'm doing just fine. Thanks for having me.
So we saw you at the 2024 Contact in the Desert Conference. What'd you think of that? I know you're a bit outside the UFO community and you're firmly entrenched in the aviation safety. What'd you think of the conference?
Well, I was quite impressed by it because I knew of the subject in general for quite some time. And in fact, back in 2014, I was actually electronically on the same show with Nick Pope on a show dealing with UFOs and airliners. So seeing these folks in the flesh was a bit of a revelation.
It's a lot of fun. I saw your lecture there, which was great, by the way. And it's nice to get the perspective from an aviation safety expert like yourself on this phenomenon. This issue comes up from time to time for us as we hear these different reports from airline pilots and from military personnel, and we genuinely wonder, if the Pentagon really has this ATIP program they've admitted they have, and if these pilots really are seeing these objects, as Ryan Graves says, all the time, isn't there a genuine risk to flying?
Well, certainly there's a risk, either a direct risk, for example, if you have some kind of aerospace vehicle, I don't care what it is, in the same airspace as you and you don't know they're there, you can have a mid-air collision. But more likely is someone sees something or the instruments send something and decisions are made and actions are taken, which don't have to be taken. And you might have a situation where, oh my gosh, something's coming at me when it's not, and you lose control of the aircraft. So regardless of what was causing that reaction, whether it was a solid object, whether it was a projection, it doesn't really matter. My concern from the aviation safety perspective is how does it affect the people in the system, the technology in the system, or the infrastructure in general, whether that's losing power, losing control, making poor decisions, etc.
Would you say that some people in the aviation community take this more seriously than, let's say, the government may lead on, or the perception may be, not even jumping to the speculation that these could be ET craft or anything, but just the fact that there seems to be stuff flying around that I would think any pilot would be concerned about, whatever it is?
Well, certainly that sort of thing is taken seriously, but not formally, in the sense of, even in my experience in aviation, both military and civilian, I've heard stories for years. I thought, okay, they saw something, it was really weird, but there's nowhere to go with this. In the military context, when I was in the Air Force, if it didn't affect the mission, didn't affect the equipment or the people involved with the mission, it wasn't something that you would report. It was an interesting thing, but not really our concern. In the civilian world as well, unless it has something to do with a reportable event, for example, an accident or incident, or it had something to do with interrupting whatever the civilian mission is, for example, an airline flight landing on time, you wouldn't necessarily report it. And here's the important thing. It might be reported, it might be talked about within a company, within an organization, within even a whole geographical area. But if there's no formal requirement to report it, the rest of the industry would have no idea about it, including myself, even though I keep close track of all sorts of safety databases and aviation news. Unless someone reports it formally, I really can't go anywhere with it.
Well, as a pilot, I would think, you've got to wonder to yourself, do you report it? Like you said, if it doesn't affect my flight, it doesn't affect my mission, do you report this? Should you report this? It doesn't seem like there's any incentive really to do so. In fact, there may be some reasons not to do so, right?
Well, some of the reasons might be common sense. And I talked about this in my presentation. The FAA actually has in one of their regulations a specific suggestion. If you see a UFO, and they did use UFO in this documentation, you can report it either to a civilian organization, and they specifically mentioned the National UFO Reporting Center, which is run by Peter Davenport, who was also at Contact in the Desert.
He was?
I wrote to him many times by email over the years. I had a nice long talk with him. That was probably the highlight of my time.
Oh, I'm so happy to hear that. He's such a nice man.
Oh, he is. And it's great that the FAA says to go to him because he is a stand-up guy. He's done fantastic work for decades compiling the things that he compiles. But the problem with that is he is not in the government. He is not supported by the government. There is no formalized process to keep that database up and running when, for whatever reason, Mr. Davenport no longer is able or willing to keep that database up. That's one part. But the second part that really got me upset, report it to your local law enforcement. And I thought, okay, I'm not a lawyer when it comes to aviation, but anything in the sky above the United States is federal responsibility. The FAA, the Department of Defense, what have you, the sky belongs to Uncle Sam, not to the states, not to the local community. So let's say I'm flying around the Bay Area. And again, in the presentation, I had an example where one of my flights in the Bay Area, I said, look, I'm going in this area. There's several jurisdictions I'm flying over, state, local, and federal. If I see something outside of my window, outside of my windscreen, I might not know which organization to call. And if I call the city, the county, the state, and the federal jurisdiction of that piece of territory, would they laugh in my face or would they take me seriously? They would do neither. They'll probably say things I can't say after contact and hang up in my face. So that was not useful. And in my world, the years I've studied aviation safety, one of the most useful things is to have solid, objective data, preferably something that's been vetted by an organization that's trusted by the aviation community. So the rest of the community can take that data and analyze it to whatever ends they have in mind. But the first step is, after something is encountered or seen, is it going to be put in a place where it can be seen by the rest of the community?
Isn't there possibly some repercussions for some of these pilots? Maybe they don't want to say that?
Well, certainly. And there have been many, many cases over the years. Probably the most famous was, I believe it was 1986 over Alaska, where there was a Japan Airlines where the crew, there was a 3-person flight crew, they saw some extraordinary things over Alaska at night in the vicinity of Anchorage. Not only that, they were communicating with the FAA. The FAA, the air traffic controllers, were apparently communicating with military assets as well. It was very well documented, so well documented that there was a fairly decent analysis done by the FAA. And as the story goes, this was one that was told by, I believe his name was Jim Callahan, who was the FAA official who was running the presentation. They had a presentation, a lot of government representatives, including apparently someone from the national intelligence area. And after the meeting, he was told, everything in this room, we're taking it with us. Everything in the room was given. He followed orders. But everything that was in his office or not in that room was not taken. And he has for years gone out and said to anyone who's willing to listen what they saw, what they analyzed. And just the useful information that was from that analysis was fantastic. The best I'd ever seen.
Absolutely. He specifically said he described it, the pilot, as 2 small ships and a mothership. He used that word, which is unique. There was no sign of anything else on his radar or ground control's radar, even though they saw these 3 craft.
This is 1986. This was years before the first stealth aircraft was known to the public. So to have something that was apparently solid and not reflecting radar energy was not something that was common. That was very anomalous, although they didn't use the word back then. And going forward, this is something where that pilot, the captain, who was very public about what he had seen, was actually grounded by his airline for a year or more because he was public with what he saw. So yes, there are professional repercussions. Now going back further in aviation history, this is something that started in the 1950s and 60s. High-altitude pilots, military pilots who saw unusual phenomena high in the sky. Fast forward to the 80s, it wasn't until the space shuttle era that they actually started studying what they call jets and sprites, upper atmospheric lightning that goes from the upper part of thunderstorms to the lower reaches of space. Bizarre looking.
I've seen pictures of it. It's crazy. It looks like almost like a X-ray kind of gone bad. Like it's kind of crazy.
In the day, if you reported that, you'd be grounded. But now it's like, oh, we understand this. We'll note it when it happens, and we'll see if there's any effects on the aircraft. And that's the way it should go when it comes to unusual phenomena in the sky.
Yeah, it's interesting that those guys got grounded. And like you said here, this guy got grounded if you reported such a thing. You know, I can add anecdotally that I've spoke to a couple of pilots myself and an astronaut actually, who each have given me incredible sightings. And yet they didn't talk about it publicly or on the air. So there's still, something about people not wanting to report that stuff in this field. When we come back, Todd, we're going to talk about a few more cases similar to the one we just talked about. You are listening to Beyond Contact on the iHeartRadio and Coast to Coast AM Paranormal Podcast Network. We are back on Beyond Contact. It's Captain Ron talking to Dr. Todd Curtis. Dr. Curtis, let's talk about some of these famous UFO cases that have involved other aircraft. Starting with the case I mentioned in your intro, which is the 2006 UFO case that happened at Chicago O'Hare Airport, where at least a dozen employees claim to have witnessed a metallic saucer-shaped craft hovering over Gate C. Do you remember that case?
I remember it well. In fact, that case was the triggering event that made me become professionally interested in whatever was going on. Because this was November 2006, nearly 6 years after 9/11, 4 or 5 years after TSA was up and running, after Homeland Security was up and running, where airport and aviation security was top of mind with the government. And you have something. To this day, I don't know what it is, and neither does anyone else, that was violating the airspace not over an airport, but one of the most important airports in the world, the busiest airports in the world, one of the top 5 or 10. And nothing officially was done. It's hovering over a terminal in full view of personnel on the ground. No investigation by the FAA or the FBI or whomever. I said to myself, look, there have been hundreds of millions of tax dollars going to these organizations. Here is a humongous example of, hey, investigate this, because check it out. If I'm a bad guy or bad woman sitting over across the world thinking, if I want to attack an airport in America, all I have to do is make it look like a flying saucer and I can just waltz right in. No one's going to touch me. So again, I got mad, and instead of writing an angry letter to the editor, I said, what can I do about this from my professional perspective? So I started to ask questions like, what's the risk? Risk is a very specific term in the regulatory world of aviation. Risk is something you can measure. It's a combination of some likelihood of an unwanted event, the consequences of that event, and the magnitude of those things put together. For example, chance of a plane crashing, very, very low. The consequence, many people killed. So yes, that is a risk. You can measure it. You can hang a number on it. What is the action? What was the effect on the aircraft? What was the damage to the system? So looking at it from that perspective, I began to get a much better feel for it. And subsequent to Chicago, the next triggering event was Leslie Kean. She had her book in 2010 about UFOs, generals, and she had documented cases from around the world where you had high-level officials, France, U.S., Iran, elsewhere, who spoke in detail and sometimes in their own words about what they had experienced. And I was so impressed with that, I actually reached out to her, and this is 2013. She actually came on my podcast on my website, and we had a lovely conversation. It's still out there on the internet. You can hear Leslie and I.
Yeah, it's great, actually. That's when her UFO book came out.
And my attitude really hasn't changed since then. What has changed is my ability to go out there and see if there's any additional evidence out there, not just evidence from people talking online or whatever, but are there formal reports in any sort of database that's reputable that has these things? And there is one database funded by the United States government, which has, in my opinion, bona fide UFO/UAP cases in them. Some of them are just pretty stunning as well. This is NASA's Aviation Safety Reporting System database, something that's been up and running since the late 1970s, where the purpose is to encourage pilots, mechanics, and others to send in reports that affect aviation safety. And the thing about this is anonymous. You send in a report, it ends up on their database. Your name's not associated with it. The aircraft tail number isn't associated with it. Your company name isn't associated with it. And NASA is very proud of the fact they've had, I think it's something like 1.5 to 2 million reports over the years. They've never had the privacy of the reporting people violated. And here's the big end. They have a staff of people who review all these, experts in aviation, air traffic control, mechanics. So if you put in some report, they'll look it over. They might even call you up again and ask you more questions. So is it possible you can put in a bogus report? Sure. But professionally, if you're a pilot, a mechanic, air traffic controller, flight attendant, anyone who has to be certified by the FAA, and you lie to the FAA via NASA, many things can happen to you, none of them good. So there's a huge incentive to tell it to them straight.
It's great that you have plausible deniability by using that system if you don't have to put your name on it.
Absolutely. As good as the database is, and I did find literally 13 events, which I talked about in the presentation, that I thought fit the criteria that I have for what a UAP is. I didn't see any events around times and places you would think. For example, I went into the database, which goes back to 1988. I said, okay, what about the month of November 2006?
Chicago O'Hare, right there.
Yeah, exactly. They give you the month, they don't give you the day. So I said, all right, let me give the month of November, state of Illinois, how many reports were in there. I went through every report. None of them had something to do with the O'Hare event. Stephenville, Texas, which was during the George W. Bush administration, where
That's in 08.
That's in 08. Stephenville, Texas. I went through the entire month, nothing. Phoenix Lights, 97. I did Phoenix, Arizona, and Nevada for that entire month, nothing. By the way, Phoenix Lights, reportedly Kurt Russell, who was a licensed pilot at the time, he saw whatever this object was, has talked about it in public since then. But to the best of my knowledge, he hasn't filed a formal report or informal report.
Well, he called it in. There's a recording. You can actually find the recording of him calling it in. We were going to invite him to Contact in the Desert because of that. I don't think he filed with this. It doesn't seem like people are filing using this system. You just named all these things, and there are no reports about this.
Well, the aviation safety reporting system is something that if you are in aviation, you may or may not be aware of, in part because there are two kinds of data you tend to have when it comes to aviation safety reporting. That which is required to be reported, that which is voluntary. If you have an accident, as defined by the NTSB, you're required to report it within so many days or you'll be in big trouble. And if it's a serious incident, also it has to be reported. Just about everything else is voluntary. For example, there is a database called the Near Mid-Air Collision System database, where you didn't have a mid-air collision. You might not have even been in a situation where traffic controllers reported it. But if you're a pilot and you're in a situation, it's like, oh my gosh, let me report this almost accident that happened. There's another database for wildlife strikes to aircraft, another one for laser encounters, another one for errant drones. Drones are misbehaving. These are all voluntary, as is the ASRS system of NASA.
I see. Very interesting. Todd, I actually remember this case that we were talking about earlier about the 2006 O'Hare case. And I remember it came out and then it just sort of went away and we never really got an explanation. You know, this is another example of the government not acknowledging anything about anything unidentified in the sky. I recently mentioned on the air how there's this disconnect somehow in our government. On one hand, they've come out recently and acknowledged the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, that they had that they were doing that. They acknowledged that several of these leaked videos are authentic military videos. They acknowledged in 2001 that the director of the National Intelligence released a report saying they couldn't explain 143 out of 144 UAP cases that it looked at. Yet, on the other hand, we have this long history from the government of blatant denial of anything to do with UFO phenomenon, going back to Project Sign, Grunge, Blue Book, the other so-called reports, the Robertson Panel, the Condon Committee, all of these things. Then in 2024, we get this new department called the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. And we thought we're going to get some real information here. But they came out with this ridiculous conclusion that there's absolutely nothing to see. Not even acknowledging that there might be objects in the sky that we can't explain. It's just simply not realistic. How do you feel about the government responses like this?
Well, the government, of which, full disclosure, I used to be a part of, I was an Air Force officer, and I was assigned both the Flight Test Center at Edwards, and I was actually at the National Security Agency the last part of my service. So I got a look-see at the intelligence community from the inside. So the government has many parts when it comes to aviation. And generally, you have the civilian part, and you have the military part. And many of their safety programs and reporting systems are quite separate from one another. If you're in a civilian aircraft, something goes seriously wrong and there's a crash, there'll be an investigation. There'll be a detailed report. Anyone around the world can download that report and the supporting documents of it. The same sort of accident happens in the military. You'll be lucky if you get a one-page summary saying, this is the accident and this is kind of what happened, and that's it. My colleagues and I did a podcast about an accident on Air Force One about 5 years ago that caused $4 million worth of damage. Someone used the wrong tools on an oxygen system. The average person would think, this is crazy. There was only a one-page report available to the public. The details were in the military file somewhere. Can't access them. But let's go back in time to Chicago. 2006. Was there a requirement for the FAA to report this event? To the best of my knowledge, there was not a formal regulatory requirement in the regulations that dictate how the FAA behaves that required them to report it. Could you as a civilian ask for a Freedom of Information Act request for things like air traffic control tapes, inner reports, etc.? You could have. You put it on a public database online, easily accessible. You put it behind a FOIA wall, it's available, but you have to work for it. So, in my opinion, there was no reporting of it because there was no requirement to report it.
Well, we're going to take a break there. You're listening to Beyond Contact on the iHeartRadio and Coast to Coast AM Paranormal Podcast Network. We are back on Beyond Contact. We're talking with Dr. Todd Curtis. Dr. Curtis, do you know of any cases involving a plane hitting one of these unknown objects like a UAP or even like a close call with one?
I don't. And I've literally looked at thousands of accident and incident reports over the decades I've been in the business. This for one of two reasons. A, it never happened, or B, it happened, and whoever wrote the report wrote it in such a way to write around the fact that this was something highly unusual. And more full disclosure, had I been I was at Boeing for a number of years as a safety engineer, which I'd never seen a report at Boeing, but had we seen one, I'm pretty confident we would have done exactly that. It's like, okay, this airplane crashed. The reports are something really bizarre hit it. We'll write a full report and do our level best not to mention the bizarre part, because otherwise it would not be seen as credible for our own colleagues. And also we might cause some bad blood with people we have to have a long-term relationship with in the government. So there is an incentive to, I wouldn't say lie, but I would say tell as little truth as possible.
Well put, yeah.
That's not a conspiracy. That's just organizational and bureaucratic survival at work.
I'm going to use that in my dating world. I think that's a good one, Todd. I like that. Hey, do you feel any of these things could be anomalous? Where do you sit? Do you feel like any of this could be something unknown?
Oh, absolutely. There is one of the 13 that were in the ASRS database I talked about in my presentation. There were a couple where what I would call conventional objects in very unconventional places. For example, you're flying 15 or so miles from New York and you see a missile go by, and the pilot reported, I could see that the missile had a rounded shape in the front. And I thought to myself, okay, I've been around a few missiles here and there in the military. How close do you have to be, or how big does this missile have to be for you to know what shape it was? And by the way, you're like 15 miles out of New York City. There are no military test ranges anywhere near that territory. Having a missile flying without everyone knowing about it, the FAA says, hey, we have missile tests going on between this hour and this hour, avoid this space. To have someone fire this without going through the protocols would put that program, whatever that program is, in jeopardy. Not to mention all the flights that were put in jeopardy. So yeah, that's one kind of anomaly in that it's a conventional object in an unconventional space. There was at least one other one in there. It's like, I have no idea what this is. This looks like nothing I've ever seen. And whatever was flying this thing had extraordinary piloting skills, well beyond what you would expect from even an above average pilot.
What do you speculate that could be? Do you think it could be a test military craft? Do you think it could be drones? Could it be a foreign government? Could it be something off-world?
I'll give you a very short description of the most bizarre one, and I'll let you tell me what you think. A sailplane pilot, which has no engine on it. He's flying near Albany, New York. He's about 3,500 feet above the ground. There's another person in back. This person's first flight in a glider. He sees something that's about 6 foot tall, too small to have a person inside of it. Has like a speckled, shiny, rainbowy thing on the top, a couple of antenna thingies sticking out on the bottom. He sees it flying, in my estimation, about 300 miles an hour, very close to the ground. Okay, drones existed in 2015. Drones going 300 miles an hour? I don't think so. But it gets worse, or more bizarre. It goes toward this distant mountain. Then it comes directly at this glider, passes by his right wing, does a U-turn, ends up forming off about 50 feet off his left wing. That's an air show kind of maneuver that you would see the Blue Angels or the Thunderbirds do. And you would not see them do it unless everyone involved knew exactly what was going on. This was a sailplane pilot who does not have the ability to do juking and jiving maneuvers to get out of the way. And this thing with extraordinary capability is flying in formation. And I love it. The statement said in the write-up, this is why I decided to go back to the airport. And I thought, this is a smart pilot. He's getting the heck out of Dodge. But wait, there's more. 2 similar objects about 6 foot tall come out of the clouds, form up with the first one, flies off into the distance. Now, any one small part of that could be a conventional craft of some kind. Everything put together makes no sense whatsoever. What about you?
Classic UAP case. I mean, that is, by definition, right there. That's an unidentified phenomenon going on right there. I think that's a great one. I've never heard it.
Well, it's a certified, vetted, government-sponsored database that is open to the entire world to go look at. And again, in my presentation, I had links to the actual code number. You can go in there yourself, download this, look at it yourself, scratch your head and say, what's going on?
Right. How often do you stumble across things that are of interest like that?
Very rarely, because, again, I very specifically said to myself as a little research project, is there anything in any formal database that looks this bizarre? I would go to the NTSB database, do searches for the word UFO or UAP and whatnot. And I thought, let me try the aviation safety reporting system. That's when I hit pay dirt. I only did 3 searches. One had a single word missile, about 400 events, like 3 or 4 of them were legitimate. Another single word, UAV, which is the acronym for a drone, unmanned aerospace vehicle. There were like 60 of those, and 4 of them were legit. And there was actually a coded variable in the database for UFO. So I did, okay, let me do a general search. UFO, UAP, unidentified flight object, et cetera, et cetera. There were 9 of them, 6 were legit. And I quit doing a search after that. Hey, I did 3 searches in like 20 minutes, and I found 13 events. If I spent a whole lot more time doing this, I'll probably find more in that specific database. So this is my challenge to the audience. Go check out the Aviation Safety Reporting System. Figure out how to use their search process, which is very easy. See if you can find something, please.
That is awesome. We should all take a look at that and see if we can't come up with more. Dr. Curtis, let's talk about that San Francisco case in 2013.
This was a conventional accident. This was a 777 on July 6, 2013. Happened to be a Saturday, and it crashed, killing 3 people on board. I had been a Boeing engineer years before, working on the 777 project. This was the very first fatal crash of a 777. And I was out of Boeing at that time and did the occasional media interview. And as soon as I found out that Saturday morning it's a crash, I said to myself, my God, it's 777 and no one called me? Typically, when there's a major airline crash in the U.S., I get all sorts of phone calls, emails, text messages. I had nothing. I called around to producers I knew. And I called down to Atlanta and say, hey, I'm in New York. Is there a studio I can go to? Somebody wants to ask me a question. I said, oh, yeah, go down the road, Columbus Circle. We have a studio there. I hadn't followed CNN, so I didn't realize they had basically moved their major operations to New York. So I walk into this big room, 50 desks. Don Lemon's off in the corner of the little studio giving his talk. I thought, oh, my God, I thought I'd be in a little room for 5 minutes. I'll have 5 minutes with Don Lemon. This will make my day. It's a tragic event. People had died, but I had a job to do, give some information, then go out and party. It's like Saturday in New York. Why did they call me and let me come in? Because everyone was on vacation. Oh. Their producers couldn't be called up. There were all sorts of experts who they couldn't call. It's like, I showed up. It's like, okay, my 5 minutes are up. I'm about to leave this. Oh, Dr. Curtis, would you like to stay for a little bit longer? 6 hours later, I leave the studio. And all day I'm thinking, okay, we're on live. I have to give some useful information, very little information starting off. I try to keep it. My usual MO is I'm going to stick with facts and data. If I have an opinion, I'll state an opinion. I'll try and give some context to similar accidents, in that city or that aircraft type, etc. And it was an eye-opening experience seeing media work in real time at CNN. I thought, my God, this is like the pinnacle of live news, and I'm the only guy they got. You got to be kidding me.
You are Mr. Facts and Data. That is for sure. You absolutely could be like that investigator. It's great. It's fascinating stuff. We'll be right back here talking more with Dr. Todd Curtis. You're listening to Beyond Contact on the iHeartRadio and Coast to Coast AM Paranormal Podcast Network. We are back on Beyond Contact. We're talking with Dr. Todd Curtis here. Todd, you brought up Boeing. Man, in 2024, there's been a lot of stuff happening with Boeing. They had the door fall off. They had the wheel fall off. What do you feel about all that?
With respect to Boeing or any entity, if you have a crash of a certain type with a certain aircraft type, a certain airline, or in a certain country, there tends to be heightened awareness of anything happening in that same context. So Boeing, after their 737 MAX events, there's a heightened awareness when anything happens. For example, wheel falling off an airliner happens multiple times a year around the world. Very rarely is it national news, but if it involves a Boeing aircraft, it's national news. Anything dealing with the 737 MAX, people could have a hangnail in coach and it'll be national news if it's on the 737 MAX. So I got a call. This is one of those cases where I did get a call. They said, well, Dr. Curtis, what do you think about what just happened? Now, about 2 days before, there'd been a crash in Japan. No one got killed, but it was like a spectacular crash. Everything burned up. I start talking about the Japan crash and say, oh, no, it's the 737 MAX. It's like, what? Door fell off. What are you talking about? I look up that model of the 737. This was a later model of the 737. They actually put a different door in an area of the aircraft that wasn't on the earlier model. So it took me like a half hour to get my head around the fact that there's another door here. What's a plug door? Oh, it's supposed to be an emergency exit door unless you don't have that many seats and you're not required to put an emergency exit door. So you put what they call a plug door. It's a simple fix. You basically bolt it in. It stays there permanently. This is a no-brainer technology. I'd never heard of a plug door coming out before.
No.
I called up a former NTSB board member and I said, have you ever heard of a plug door coming off of an aircraft? He said, no. And he was a former mechanic. He'd been working on airplanes for decades.
Yeah.
So, yeah. It happened to be Boeing and the 737 MAX, so everybody, rightfully so, knows about this plug door. Boeing, rightfully so, is being taken to the woodshed.
Todd, you I think said as of May 2024, the FAA and the Department of Defense still do not have a systematic or comprehensive process for collecting and organizing UAP reports. Is that still the case? I'm assuming it is.
Let me add that there is no publicly acknowledged systematic methodology on the military or the national security side. And there is definitely nothing public on the FAA side. And by systematic, we're talking something as simple as, what is the definition of a UAP? The military and national security side of the house have a working definition. NASA actually did an independent study team back in 2023. They published the report in 2024, where they had a generalized definition of what a UAP is. Absent one from the FAA or the NTSB, I actually put together, for the purpose of the presentation, what I think is a reasonable definition of a UAP, which would, among other things, include a classic UFO, and like I said earlier in our discussion, a conventional aircraft in an unconventional location, or a phenomena that is simply, unknown and unexplainable. I would like them to follow something, not exactly mine, but something where it's comprehensive, it's objective, it's something where if you're a pilot or an air traffic controller and you see a UAP, you'd like to look up in the regs and say, okay, does this fit the definition, yes or no? If yes, I go report it over here. That system does not yet exist.
And you say that this information, forget all this alien ET crap, whatever. You say that just compiling all this information, using that data, you are saying even old data from 50 years ago, can help us with safety in flight today, correct?
Absolutely. Aviation safety is what I like to describe as something that does not care about time or space. There are events that happened almost 100 years ago, for example. Everyone in the world has seen the famous picture of the Zeppelin going up in Lakehurst, New Jersey, the Hindenburg. Classic case. And some of the elements of that you can still learn from today if you're in the aviation safety business. So yes, if you have an encounter from 50 years ago, there's certain characteristics. You have one from 50 minutes ago, certain characteristics. Are there similarities? Is there a pattern that one should look for? And if you had this certain pattern, does that inform you as to what counter moves a pilot should make should they encounter something like this? If you knew nothing about Starlink, you're flying along and you see 50 lights in a row going across the sky above you. You're flying at 30,000 feet. Your first thought might be, that's at 50,000 feet. Because of the speed and the distance, looks like the speed of a stratospheric airliner going over. You say, who the heck is flying 50 airliners in a row without reporting?
For sure.
If no one feels that they have the ability or be respected if they report this, if no one reports this, you cannot analyze it. If you can't analyze it, you can't make rational decisions as to what to do next. You can't assess the risk and therefore assess the potential safety impacts without the data.
You've mentioned these drones several times today. Do you know where we're at with the drone technology? Because it feels to me like, these things seem like they could be quiet. They run on hydrogen or electric. There's different things they're proposing. It seems like we're on the cusp of these drones becoming more manned drones I'm talking about coming out soon. This might lead to a whole bunch of UAP reports because people won't know what they're seeing.
For that, I recommend that people look at all the many, many, many videos that are coming out of Ukraine. The evolution of drone technique and technology is like massive going on over there. There are things that I look at that and it's like, yeah, this is conventional technology being used in ways that the military minds in the Pentagon never thought of because they have to rapidly evolve their technique and their skills in the field. So yes, this will inform the design of future technology and how that future technology is used. Right now today, you or I can, off the shelf, go to Amazon, get a semi-autonomous drone where you can program it to fly a certain place, take pictures, and come back. It's only a small hop, skip, and a jump to program it to do something other than take pictures. And you see that happening in Ukraine as we speak.
I can imagine this is going to get even more convoluted than it is already. Before I let you go, I definitely want to ask you about, you've been in aviation for a long time, obviously. Have you looked at these different videos, the famous military videos that came out, like the Tic Tac video, the Go Fast and Gimbal? Have you seen those, and what are your thoughts on those?
I have, and I sort of casually looked at them until the government said, yes, these are authentic videos, and we don't know what they are. It's like, what? You're acknowledging that this multi-billion-dollar over decades technology caught something that you can't explain. Now I'm really intrigued. Yes, I have seen those and seen many others. And some of them, it's like, okay, I've been around aviation for a while. In fact, 1980s, when I was at Edwards, I was working at a test facility where they had some of the early infrared targeting systems for aircraft. This is like, 84, 85. And crude by today's standards. But even back then, it was like a revelation to see what this technology could do. We've had 40 years of improving computers and microchips and everything else. So not just infrared, not just visible light. You also have electromagnetic sensing systems on board aircraft. You also have multiple platforms. You might have space-based assets combined with land-based assets and in the atmosphere assets and human eyeballs looking at the same thing, compiling that information, and then coming to a conclusion way more complex than just a single tic-tac video. And this happens on a daily basis.
Oh, wow.
If something big happens, like another Phoenix Lights was 97, Chicago was 2006. This is before the iPhone era. If it happens today, it'll be like Kobe's helicopter crash. You have all kinds of doorbell cams, audio cams. We'll have more information you can shake a stick at. So if something happens,
that's the way I think about that now. When Roswell happened, nobody had a camera, nobody knew it. Now, my God, I think if something did happen, we're going to have a lot of footage.
Oh, yeah.
Wow. Well, we're going to have to stop there, Todd. I really, really appreciate it. I've really enjoyed talking to you about this stuff. So thanks for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me.
Absolutely, brother. Thanks for listening to Beyond Contact. We're going to be back next week with an all-new episode. You can follow me, Captain Ron, on Twitter and Instagram at CITD_Captain Ron. Stay connected by checking out contactinthedesert.com. Stay open-minded and rational as we explore the unknown right here on the iHeartRadio and Coast to Coast AM Paranormal Podcast Network.